Well, thank you very much. I'm going to start off with the story. Back in 2016, in the winter of 2016, Leigh was having a beer with one of his students. Dr. Leigh Griffin is not only an engineering manager at Red Hat, but he also works at the local university helping students and doing lectures, mostly on Agile, but sometimes on other things. So he works with the computer science group there, and he usually stops in about every month to work with them. And the student was very frustrated. And he was talking about his final year project, and he was getting negative marks on his use of Scrum in his final year project. And so Leigh wanted to dig a little deeper on that, and what he found out was 2 years previously, a lot of the interns were returning from working out in different companies very excited about Scrum, because we all know it is exciting when you encounter it for the first time, and they wanted the program to incorporate it. They wanted the faculty incorporated into the computer science program. And so the faculty did exactly that. They said, let's make this part of our program, and we're going to show our commitment to Scrum and to our students, our upcoming computer science students, and we're going to make Scrum part of the final year project. And we're so committed to it, we're going to make it 20% of the grade. So the students, if you think about that, they're being asked to work on a project by themselves for a year, highly focused, and use Scrum. Yeah, thank you. Somebody got the joke. Yeah, there's a problem there. So what does the Scrum Guide say about the size of a team? We'll start there. 3 to 9, yeah, so 7 plus or minus 2, depending on what edition and what year you read it the last. But yeah, it's a bigger group. So needless to say, this was a problem. And then Leigh found out from his student that they were actually getting negative marks on these papers, or on their tracking of this use of Scrum on their final year projects, and they're getting yelled at and they're getting negative marks, and they're feeling terrible about it, very frustrated. So they did what most people do when they're being asked to track data on something that doesn't really apply to them. They fudge the numbers. So they started kind of basically lying about it. Now, lying is a bad thing, obviously. So this struck Leigh as a real problem. He says, not only are these students trying to fudge these numbers and fudge this data on using Scrum, but they're also very frustrated because they're learning Scrum wrong. They're getting a bad taste in their mouth about what Scrum can do. So Leigh, being an Agilist to the soul, he came up with an idea. He started thinking about, wouldn't it be great if we could use Scrum and modify it to fit this model? Because these students were really frustrated. And the more he thought about it, he thought, there's a lot of teams out there who work on these really small projects, and we look for smaller groups and subsets, sort of like the splinters they were talking about in the previous mob programming discussion. And thus, the idea of Small Scale Scrum was born. It was just the seed that had been planted. It wasn't full-fledged, even growing yet at the time, but it's planted the seed. Unfortunately, Leigh Griffin, who is now the author of the Small Scale Scrum Guide and the white paper that is associated with this talk, couldn't make it today. He is on his way back from Budapest. He'd work with a team there. He just couldn't make it timing-wise. I would love it if that was him that walked in. That would just warm the cockles of my heart. But he wasn't able to make it, so you'll have to put up with me. If you squint real tightly and pretend that I'm handsome and have an Irish brogue, it would be as though Leigh is here. Anyway, my name is Arjay Hinek, and I also work at Red Hat. I'm an Agile coach at Red Hat, working with continuous improvement. On the back end, Leigh is an engineer on the front end, and I work with a lot of the support behind the scenes. Leigh and I have been working over the last year and a half, I guess it's been that long, on our team coaching certification together. And during that time, we've talked a lot about Scrum, the way we've tried it. Of course, we've talked about coaching, but in our discussions about the different ways to use Scrum, we've found that we both kind of like to press it and push it in different directions, push it outward. Try new things with it. And Leigh particularly was focused on the small scale Scrum idea, and he had a lot to share because they'd done a lot of research. So let me go into that a little bit. Let me ask you all a few questions, though, before we go any further. How many of you are on a Scrum team and you've been told by leadership or by a customer, hey, I got this small thing to work on. Can you just spin up a Scrum team for that? Sound familiar? Yeah, a few hands. How about those of you who are consultants? How many consultants do we have? It's not a dirty word in this room. Okay, good. Yeah, so a lot of consultants are trying to, you try to go work with a company and you're told, well, we're a Scrum shop. Keep your costs low, but please use Scrum. Does that happen to you? I heard you laugh about it. Does that kind of thing happen?
Well, I'm sure it happens. I was just laughing at
Oh, yeah, okay. All right, and computer science students, we don't want to throw that out. In fact, that's kind of what drove Leigh to this, was the plight of the computer science student, because they're working in isolation and they're very frustrated, and they've been told to use Scrum. I also work with a few different universities in our area in North Carolina, and every time I talk to students, I find out that they're being taught Scrum, but it's like a Scrum light. And they're not really getting their hands on it very well. So there needs to be an improved way for them to work. And then ultimately, open source developers. Obviously, this is important to Leigh. Leigh works in the front end. Fedora is one of his products. And he works with open source developers who work often alone. They may sometimes pair up, and of course they're working with the giant network of open source development, but they're still working by themselves, and that can lead to a lot of discomfort. So he wanted to come up with something that could help all of these people. And so Small Scale Scrum, super short definition of it, Small Scale Scrum is 1 to 2 people, possibly 3 if you count a manager. 1 to 2 people working on a short-term project and delivering it and working closely with the customer. I'll go into much more detail about how that can happen and how that can work here in a second. What I do want to touch is this is sort of the foreground before the background. The foreground of this is, I want you to know that this isn't just a theory that we made up, that we're hoping it will work. It actually is working. Leigh is using it extensively in the professional services and consultancy projects. They're getting very positive feedback from customers. Customers are delighted and happy. And they're also seeing, because of a consultancy kind of mindset, people say, keep the costs down. So this is a great model that works for them for doing that. Also with students. So I mentioned that Leigh works with the university. I also work in our local area with university students. We try to feed the pipeline that's coming into Red Hat. We love the talent that comes in, and we encourage that a great deal. If any of you have ever been an intern with Red Hat, you'd know. Our interns are always very excited and do very well. So what we found is that students who use this small-scale Scrum model and then join the workforce ultimately are able to give great feedback in their first sprint. They'll come to retrospective because they have a much deeper understanding of what Scrum is about, because they've actually taken it, seen what it's supposed to be, and then torn it apart, because that's part of the process of learning about small-scale Scrum. And then finally, paid for commercial research projects. You know, when you try to pull in a whole team to work on a research project, we know that doesn't work very well. But if you can spin out a couple of people and have them completely focused, this is very close to the splinter idea they were talking about earlier, but over a much longer term, you're going to have far better benefits. You're going to get something that's actionable. So, I told you that short story in the beginning of how this all started. Let's take it, how did we get to where things are starting to be successful? So early in 2017, Leigh was thinking about the project, this topic, and working with some of his engineers, and he decided to present about it in Agile Cambridge 2017. And the talk was on quality in small teams. But part of that whole talk was they created a survey, a 59-question survey, and they were trying to it was basically crowdsourcing ways to build this small scale Scrum idea. They were asking for people who were either on a small team or who had experimented with small teams, not necessarily 2-person teams, but small teams. Finding out what was making it work, what was making it fail, what was making it tripping them up, what were the ways that they could improve quality. And all these questions, there's 59 questions, this huge body of information. So they collected that, and they began to assemble it, but they didn't know quite what to do with it. But things worked out pretty well, because Agnieszka Gankarczyk also worked for Red Hat as a consultant. She went to Dr. Leigh once, and she said, hey, I'm working on my dissertation for my computer science degree. Can you recommend any topics? And Leigh thought of a few. He gave her a list, but because she was a consultant, the one that jumped right out at her was this idea of small scale Scrum. So she began to write her thesis on it, and she went out and she interviewed managers, she interviewed Agile teams, she interviewed coaches. She did extensive research from that angle, but she also decided to create a small model of it. And being a good Agilist herself, she used the empirical method. She had small teams try it, or consultancies, and also some students. And she set them to work and had them give her more feedback as part of her thesis. There's a link to her thesis in the Small Scale Scrum Guide. I highly recommend reading it. Dissertations aren't always the most exciting thing in the world, but I really enjoyed that one. And then Leigh and Aggie worked together on publishing this concept of small scale Scrum in opensource.com and a series of blogs, and which ultimately led to the Small Scale Scrum Guide. So there's now a guide that exists out there that people can use, and it's open and it's free to everyone. So that brings us to today and why I'm so excited to be here. We're continuing this, and we're going to crowdsource version 2.0 of this. At the very end, I'm going to give you a link where you guys can log on and get the URL. Sounds like they're making cookies in the background, so we'll just pause that for a moment. But so you'll get the link, and you can go out and give us the feedback. And we'll talk a lot about that at the end. But I'm excited to be here to talk to you about this, and I hope you guys are excited to take part. So what is small scale Scrum? We'll just touch on this very lightly. What is it? What's important to us about it? So it is about communication and collaboration. If you think about just having two people on a team, that's going to heighten the intensity of the way they collaborate and the way they communicate with each other, as well as the way they communicate to the outside world. They're also going to have to work on the engagement model with how they work with their customer. If you only have two people and no product owner and no Scrum Master, because really they're filling those roles, they're going to have to get out and be in front of the customer all the time. And it's a very different model, and it does require a very different person, and we'll talk about that at the end. But it also answers and deals with this motivation issue that where people are working in silo or working alone, either students or open source developers, or even developers on our teams oftentimes find themselves very siloed. And this addresses that issue. It gives them a structure, a model to work with. And finally, performance and quality are very important, and they're built into the way this structure should work. And I'll get into that in a second. The way this structure should work is based on a set of values. So they didn't tear apart the original Scrum values. They kept those intact. As was mentioned at the beginning, they wanted to maintain what Scrum is about because they believed in it. But they decided to add some other Agile values, 6 of them. Yes, these are my people. They didn't throw them away. In fact, they added 6, and we're going to go through those really quickly right now. So multiple project responsibilities over fixed assignments. Now, we all know if we've been a Scrum Master on a team, or if we've worked with a team, we know that we try not to have fixed assignments. We want people to be cross-functional, right? But we all also know that people tend to gravitate to their areas that they prefer. We want cross-functionality. We want people to be self-organizing, but we realize that isn't always the case. But we're always striving for it. In small-scale Scrum, it's not an option. In small-scale Scrum, with only 2 people, they have to fill all the roles. So it's not a nice to have. But more importantly, it does have a direct impact on pretty much all the other values. As I said, there's no product owner, so guess what? Things happen more quickly. There's a more direct contact with the customer. There's more direct contact with one another constantly. Some of those problems you have with a large team, or even a mob programming, they get changed. Most of them go away, but you do have to swap it for a couple more. With only 2 people, those 2 people really have to work well together, right? Wide communication over narrow communication. So we're not saying that we don't communicate. We're saying that in communication on a 2-person team requires those people to have a hyper focus on how they talk to one another. If someone breaks the build, It's not well, someone broke the build. It's like, we broke the build, right? So there's this constant contact with one another. They have to work well together, but there's also focus on that communication with the customer, because they're right out in front of the customer. They should be meeting with them daily. I know that says that. We say that in one of the Agile principles is meeting daily. How many people actually meet with their customer daily? Yeah, not a lot of hands, right? It's what we aspire to. In small scale Scrum, part of it is that when you initiate a small scale Scrum engagement, that becomes an expectation that's put up front with the customer, okay? There's this nearly obsessive focus on how you communicate. Because it's only two people, you don't have that group of, well, hopefully somebody will say this to the customer, or say this to the organization, or to the project managers. Instead, you only have two people really who can be the ones who are responsible for that communication. So they really focus on making sure the right information is getting out there, not just bombarding people with emails about general updates. And finally, they actually added a ceremony to the overall group of ceremonies as a proof of concept demo. It's really not that much of an addition. It's sort of like a sprint demo or sprint review, but it's very focused on that project and proof of concept. As I mentioned, this is about small projects. It's niche. It's not about, you can't use this everywhere. This is for a very specific set. But it's a set that, as I've walked around this conference for the last few days, I'm finding is a set that a lot of people have a need for, which is exciting to hear. Quality delivery over speed of development. We're not saying we're throwing out speed, and we're also not throwing out the concept that we iterate and every 2 weeks we get feedback. In fact, it's a hyper focus on getting feedback from the customer. So that shared ownership of delivering features and getting them in front of the customer and getting the feedback right away kind of short circuits the concept of the sprint demo. It's in fact nearly daily you're getting feedback, because they're talking to their customers and the customers are telling them, no, we don't like that, or yes, that might be a good way to go, or here's another problem I'm having. With only 2 developers, there's of course that decreased chance of bugs. And as I said, breaking the build, everybody knows who broke the build when you're on a 2-person team. Both of you did. And as I said, this is the biggest departure from Scrum, where on a Scrum team, we're trying to get feedback. We iterate, we build, we iterate. It might not be perfect, but we want to hear what the customer wants. This is the one that I have the hardest time with, but I've come to believe in it, and that is by being in front of the customer, you're actually doing a much shorter cycle on iterating. You're not building something in 2 weeks, get the feedback, hope we got it, throw a little technical debt and address it later. It's, okay, now we're going to make this change. You tell us what you think. So this, in some cases, or in some ways, the small scale Scrum team always involves the customer, because there's so much more involvement from the customer. But doesn't that make the project go slower if you're just building these features and not getting things out in front of the customer? But actually, what it does is, because you're getting completed features with less tech debt and fewer cycles of iteration, you're actually shortening the overall life cycle of the whole project. So there's 3 more. Team feature delivery over individual responsibility. This one, Leigh and I talked a lot about, because of what makes a good team, a larger Scrum team work really well, is everybody has that accepted sense of individual responsibility for themselves and for the team. It's a requirement. But with 2 people, there's not as much focus required. It almost happens automatically. And because they're focused on delivering these sprints or delivering these features, sprint planning becomes a lot more shortened. The duration of sprint planning is really just the 2 people sitting down going, hey, remember what we talked about yesterday or 2 days ago with the customer? That's what's in our backlog. They don't have a huge backlog because it's really only 2 people. So they're not working on a massive list of things. It's much easier for them to keep in context what it is they're building and why they're building it. And there's not a negotiation with the product owner, because they themselves are that product owner. Decreased focus on estimation. Thank you. Decreased focus on estimation is, I think, one of my favorite pieces of this is because they don't care as much about building their velocity rate, their confidence interval, because it's a short-range project. So they're not focused on that. Instead, they say, let's just talk about how many features we can deliver and how we're going to deliver it. And I already touched on it, that they're in charge of requirement gathering, which has a direct impact also on what the planning looks like. Accelerating innovation over request-driven thinking. One of my favorite things about being a Scrum Master, the years that I was doing that, was that I loved it when a mature team, a product owner, would bring just the problem statement to the team, and then the team would talk with that product owner, and they'd talk about the clarification of it, and they'd build acceptance criteria, and it was a great way to work, except it was a bit time-consuming, and I didn't realize it at the time, but the teams were really thinking about all of their work as solving a puzzle. Small Scale Scrum kicks it up a notch. Instead of solving a puzzle, they're focused on figuring out what caused the puzzle in the first place, because they're right there with the customer learning about it. And as it says in the second bullet there, they have a direct line to the customer's problems. So they can get in deeper and they can understand the architecture, but they are also learning there's just that filter that's been removed without the product owner. Now that does require a very special relationship between the developers and the customers. I'm not saying it's easy. I'm saying but it is incredibly effective. Speaking of improvement, okay, they can envision deeper ways to help the customers improve, but they're not just seeking to delight the customer through negotiations. They're actually partnering with the customer at all times. And I think this is probably one of the most valuable pieces of all of it, is that because they're working with that customer and learning what their problems are and digging deeper into their architecture and deeper into their problems, they can come up with things that might help the customer in the future. Not now, not the initial problem, but these are some other things that you're having, Mr. or Mrs. Customer. This is something that you could improve on. And giving a customer that kind of feedback can be incredibly valuable, both for the overall project, but also for the entire relationship. So, but does it work? Well, I showed you some of the things we're using it at Red Hat, but Aggie's research revealed this. She had 3 students that were the top 3 in their class. 2 students who used it were in the top 2. 3 other students scored very high, one of which got a 96%, which was the highest score ever for a final year project. So yeah, I think those students believe in this. But more mind-blowing is the 8 out of 8 consultancies with 100% success rate. Success being measured by customer satisfaction, delivering on time, and customer delight at what was delivered. And finally, I think that another great key indicator is 4 of those signed on for return engagements. That, to me, seems like somebody was doing something right, and they were using Small Scale Scrum. So, there's some things you got to look for. It sounds pretty cool, right? It sounds like it's like, oh my gosh, maybe this is the silver bullet. It is not a silver bullet. It requires some certain things. So, you got to look out for it. You got small, short, intensive projects. That's what fits this. But also disciplined individuals. You're not going to be able to just take a brand new developer who doesn't know how this works or isn't good at communicating or isn't good at disciplining themselves. It does require somebody with maturity and expertise. Customer-facing developers. This one, actually, somebody asked me about this earlier at the conference. They said, so basically it requires you having 2 unicorns. And it's like, no, not all developers are object to meeting with customers. In fact, I know many developers who I wish could be in front of the customer instead of the product owner. Because they know the system well and they're very well spoken and they're good at processing that information. So people who work well in pairs, as I said, yeah, that now we're starting to get into the harder space. But we know, as I've talked through this, many of you, your mind probably went to, well, isn't this kind of like paired programming? It is, for sure, but there's a lot more involved because it's talking about dealing with the customer, gathering that data, and doing so much more. And then finally, as I said, clear alliance with the customer. They have to have that. So you have to have somebody who can work with the customer. And the customer has to be willing to work with the team. So what's next? Let's get more people to try this. And here's what we want you to do. Please get out your phones and use this QR code. We would love it if you would take the survey. Again, this is also going to be available. All these slides are available. We'd love it if you take the survey. If you have questions or you want to know more about this, go to opensource.com and read the guide. But also join the open source DevOps team. They're a wonderful group, and I absolutely love going to opensource.com. You can learn so much there. I'm not a technical person, and so I go there constantly. I'm trying to learn more about OpenShift, more about Kubernetes, more about what Red Hat does, but you can also learn about all kinds of other technical practices there. So use these QR codes. So what else? One last thing. So Leigh and I have talked a lot about using this as a coaching tool, a way to assess how a team is doing, possibly find two people and have them try this for a short time. Try it out. If it works, great. If it doesn't, okay, but it was a good test. To find out, and what our hypothesis is it'll teach them a little bit more about communications, the importance of customer collaboration, any number of things. Again, it's a hypothesis. We haven't even tried it yet, but I'm inviting anybody else who wants to be, who is a coach or wants to try this, please try it. Be fearless about it. And if you don't like stick people telling you what to do, here it is again. Get more people using the Small Scale Scrum. Go to the guide, and then also take that survey, please. If you have any questions, again, here's the survey links. Please email Leigh Griffin, or you can email me. He and I talk probably 3 times a week, if not more. And that is the end. I challenge you all. Thank you. Questions? Yes?
So don't we need a Scrum Master in the small scale?
The question is, don't you need a Scrum Master in a small scale Scrum? You do. One of those two people acts as that, but what we found is it often is both people sort of share the role because they are keeping themselves on track, keeping themselves following the values, constantly thinking about the principles. And this is just me guessing, but this is probably why students do so well when they've used small scale Scrum, when they join the workforce, because they've had to be the Scrum Master actively and be the product owner actively. That's just a guess, but I'm pretty sure that has something to do with it. Yeah?
Some of the mechanics, is there a backlog, a sprint?
Oh, yeah. Thank you so much. The question is, what about the mechanics? Is there a backlog or is there a sprint? Yes, all of the things that you would normally use on a Scrum team, a full-size Scrum team exist. It's just that some of the things are shortened. Some, like the planning cycle goes much shorter because there's no product owner to have these debates with.
If you go online,
Yeah.
you will find in there a view of what they added and these values discussed.
Yeah.
With Leigh and his co-author, which is the student.
Yeah, Anglieska. Yeah, they do a really good job, but they're all there. Yeah.
What have you found? I mean, I think you got 100% commitment with 1 or 2 developers, but then there's the customer
Right.
interaction. What is what does that commitment kind of look like, and how do you prevent scope creep?
Right. So the question is 2 parts. It's, how do you get that customer engagement involved? Because it's going to require a lot more involvement from the customer. And how do you prevent scope creep? Well, the scope creep, we'll talk about that first. First, that's the team owns that, just like a product owner should. Like, let's not get this carried away. Let's not gold plate. Let's do this right. So the team owns that. So that's that discipline. But getting the customer involved, that is part and parcel to the initial meeting with the customer. So the team would be meeting with that customer and saying, we are going to do this in small scale Scrum. It has to be very overt. You can't just say, we're going to use Scrum, but we might use small scale Scrum. It needs to be, you are going to be involved and here's your involvement. So yeah, it's very, very overt and very upfront.
Does the customer sit with them? Is the customer there 150% of the time? Or?
Yeah, it depends. It all depends on how they want to work. Yeah, unfortunately, no. I'm not the one who's been able to work with the teams. That's the one drawback to well, one of the many drawbacks that Leigh isn't able to be here to answer that. But yeah, 0 minutes. Looks like I'm getting called off. I got one more question. Who was it? Yes.
Have there been any other fields other than DevOps that you tested this in?
The question is, have there been any other fields in DevOps that we've tested this in? Just in general?
I'm an InfoSec, so this might be helpful.
Yeah, I haven't. I don't. In my discussions with Leigh, there wasn't, but I intend to. So as part of my coaching, working with teams, I'm gonna. I work with IT. I work with finance. I work with marketing. I work with yeah. I believe there is. I'm gonna try it because it seems promising. Yeah, absolutely. All right. Thank you all very much.